right?
Is anybody out there?
Speak loud. I see.
It's relieved. Maybe I'll get rid of this.
All right. Richard, just leave it.
Sorry? Had a nice thing. All good? Okay.
All right.
Okay. Clear my feet.
Yeah, how's that? Hello, everyone. While we get mic'd up here, can everyone hear me all right? Good morning. I think you virtuous people who've woken up early to come here are being rewarded not only by a warm room, but by a rather spectacular pairing up here. It's a tremendous honor for me to be here with these two extraordinary writers. I realized when I was trying to compose my introduction that if I actually ran through everything each of them had done, it might take the entire hour. So I'm going to give a very brief précis of their careers. Sitting directly to my right here is Richard Holmes, who is an acclaimed biographer of Shelley, Coleridge, Samuel Johnson, or rather I should say there's a book about Samuel Johnson and a biography of his. Two books loosely on the writing of biography, and then the book he'll be reading from today, or one of the books he'll be reading from today, The Age of Wonder, which is a study of a sort of, almost a, would you call it a group biography of a sort?
Yes, or a crowded biography.
A crowded biography of a generation of romantic scientists in the late 18th and early 19th century. And most recently, a book called Falling Upwards, How We Took to the Air, which is a history of ballooning. And also joining us is AN Wilson, who is the author of some 20 novels, if I have that correct.
I think so.
Including Winnie and Wolf, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and My Name is Legion, and another 20-some books of nonfiction, including a great many biographies of his own. C.S. Lewis, Tolstoy, Walter Scott, Milton, Jesus, Hitler, John Betjeman, Dante. I was earlier thinking that, you know, if all of the characters that these two have biographied were here, we wouldn't fit on the stage. So I think what we're going to do this morning is something that's a bit of a mix of readings and conversation, hopefully to keep everyone awake and alert. I think Richard is going to start, and I'm going to ask Richard to talk a bit about the book from which he's about to read, and then he'll launch right into the reading, and we're going to bounce back and forth and you know, do a couple of readings. I think, you know, one way to situate what we're doing here is that, you know, we're spanning a time that goes from what, would you say about 1780
yeah.
until, you know, in the case of Richard's work, through to just before the reign of Queen Victoria. And then Andrew picks us up with the Victorian era. And I think both of them will have something to say, I guess, about the sort of transition between those two periods. As we sit here in what one of my dear friends yesterday, a journalist from Calcutta, called the last Victorian country on earth. Hopefully a subject we'll be able to return to. So let me pass things over to Richard, who will talk a bit. Are you going to begin with The Age of Wonder or with a balloon flight?
Now, what I hope to do is take you on a balloon flight. Seems to be the thing to do early in the morning. I'm suffused in heavenly light, but I believe you're there. But what I really want to say is, can you hear clearly at the back? Both Andrew and I, good. And if you stop hearing us, right, okay. I hope to take you on 2 balloon flights. We'll see if there's time for that. The first one is a romantic balloon flight, and the second one is a Victorian one, and that's the contrast. But we'll see how we go. This book, The Age of Wonder, which took me 8 years because I had a literary background. I'd written a lot about the Romantics, Coleridge and Shelley and so on. And it gradually became clear to me that there was a huge gap in the study of English Romantics, which is they regarded entirely as a literary phenomena. And there was no science anywhere between 1780 and 1830s when Charles Darwin sets off on his great voyage with the Beagle and so on. Almost no science, and nobody in schools was taught any science if they were studying the Romantic period. So the idea of this book was to bring the scientists and the poets and writers together. And I think it's had some effect. People now, you can't isolate them. So the kind of thing that the book opens with a young Joseph Banks jumping down on the black sands of Tahiti and keeping this extraordinary journal. He's with Captain Cook. And one of the first anthropological studies, he learns the language in Tahiti and so on. And he comes back and is president of the Royal Society. And for 32 years, he sends out young men and also some young women on various scientific expeditions. And he knows all the writers of the time, Byron, for example. And then there's the astronomer William Herschel, who discovered the first of the new planets, the seventh planet, Uranus, working in March 1781, very importantly with his sister Caroline. And again, this is the first woman astronomer. She had a government salary by the end, very, very important. A brilliant astronomer in her own right, discovered 8 comets. They were read by Keats, for example. Keats's first great sonnet, on first looking into Chapman's Homer, has a reference to the discovery of the planet. When a new planet swims into his ken. It's a great sonnet about the notion of discovery, and that refers to Herschel and Caroline's discovery of Uranus. And so it goes on. Keats, of course, with a background himself in medicine. Shelley always traveled with a telescope and a microscope, and for his 25th birthday, Mary Shelley, his very young wife, gave him a small model hot air balloon, which he flew in Switzerland, which takes me to balloons, because the whole subject of gas is a great period of chemistry. Humphrey Davy, the first of our great chemists, who was working initially with nitrous oxide, laughing gas, who was one of his volunteer experiments, 2 of them, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Robert Southey. And they were working with him in the institute in Bristol, the Pneumatic Institute, working on gases. Davy subsequently goes on to become president of the Royal Society, and that friendship between those poets and writers is in the book for poets and scientists. So, gases, it is a great period of chemistry, but that takes me to balloons, because this is the first period of man carrying balloons flight, 1783 to be exact, starting with the Montgolfiers, and then it was the chemistry spread all over Europe, because they're using hydrogen, how you make hydrogen and so on, what you can do with it, how you inflate balloons. And very soon, flights were taking place all over Europe, and therefore the romantic flight, I wanted to read you very quickly, which will also, the idea is, will give you the flavor of the romantic period. This flight is quite teasing, quite flighty, quite flirtatious, a bit sexy and suggestive. See what you make of this, all right? And the Victorian flight will be very, very different, but we may get there. So let me just read you. It's about a 3-minute read, 3 or 4 minute read, that's it. And then we'll go on for that. First thing to say is this balloonist is a woman. The first balloon flyer in England, first balloon woman flyer. So here's a little section on this. The actress, Mrs. Sage, renowned for her Juno-esque figure, left a vivid account of being the first aerial female after an eventful ascent in Monsieur Lunardi, that's the Italian Lunardi's balloon, in June 1785. The launch was made from Hyde Park, attended by a huge and increasingly raucous crowd. Mrs. Sage, in a low-cut silk dress, presumably designed to reduce wind resistance, was to be accompanied by Lunardi and the dashing Mr. George Biggin, a young and wealthy old Etonian. The gondola was draped in heavy swags of silk and had a specially designed lace-up door which allowed its occupants to be seen more clearly, as if they were installed in a luxurious aerial salon. But the combined weight of the fixtures and fittings and the 3 passengers proved too much for the balloon, which began to wallow dangerously on its moorings, to the whistles and suggestive leers of the crowd. Senor Lunardi made a rapid, though perhaps surprising decision, realizing that Mrs. Sage was the star attraction. After a hasty conference with Mr. Biggin, he himself sprang from the gondola, allowing the balloon to make a safe launch with its reduced payload of 2. He apparently had no qualms about leaving the control of the balloon and of Mrs. Sage in Mr. Biggin's sole care. Unfortunately, in his haste to depart, Lunardi had failed to do up the lacings of the gondola's door. As the balloon sailed away over Piccadilly, the crowd were treated to the provoking sight of the beautiful Mrs. Sage on all fours in the open entrance of the gondola. The crowd assumed that she had fainted and was perhaps receiving some kind of intimate first aid from Mr. Biggin. In fact, she was coolly re-threading the lacings to make the gondola safe and respectable again. As she later cheerfully admitted, she felt largely responsible for the launching difficulties, as she had omitted to inform Monsieur Lunardi that she made up 200 pounds of human weight. That's over 14 stone. And he had been far too gallant to inquire about her payload. Finally, getting to her feet as the balloon floated over Green Park, Mrs. Sage trod on Lunardi's barometer and broke it, thus depriving Mr. Biggins of any instrument with which to measure their height, because a barometer gives you air pressure and then therefore height is an altimeter. Nevertheless, in due course, the two of them were lunching. They were lunching peacefully of sparkling Italian wines, care of Monsieur Lunardi, and cold chicken, occasionally calling down to the people below through a silver speaking trumpet. Can you imagine? Okay. The flight followed the line of the Thames westwards, at one point passing through a snowstorm. Surprising for mid-June, remarked Mr. Biggin nonchalantly. Nothing can shock an old Etonian, and landed heavily near Harrow-on-the-Hill, smashing through a hedge and dragging across an unharvested hayfield. The infuriated farmer appeared and began threatening Mr. Biggin and abusing Mrs. Sage. She later described him as succinctly as far more savage than a Tahitian. But the honour of the first female aeronaut was unexpectedly saved by the young gentleman of Harrow's school, who rushed out across the fields to greet her, put together a cash collection to pacify the farmer, and carried her bodily, a lot of emphasis on that, she had hurt a tendon in her foot, and in triumph to the local tavern, where everyone evidently got gloriously drunk. I'll leave it there.
Now, I'm not sure really how to follow up on that. Can you talk just a bit, Richard, as a biographer, no article about your books fails to mention that you have sort of pioneered what I think maybe we might call a sort of a journalistic method of biography, or more grandiosely, a method acting version of biography, in which you're renowned for kind of traveling, as I believe you put it. The title of one of your books on biography is Footsteps, isn't it?
Right, yes.
So traveling to the places where your subjects lived, going to sort of see what they would have seen or inhabit the spaces they would have inhabited. Let me just ask you about how one goes researching, first of all, a balloon flight like this one. What's the sort of archival material that comes with this? Yeah. And then how many balloon flights you took yourself in the course of these two books?
A fair question, a very fair question. Yes, footstepping that's what we call this methodology.
Okay.
But it's based on a very simple and righteous thing that I think to get inside the heart and the head of your subject, you need, as far as possible, gone to everywhere where they were born, where they worked, if they had great romances, where that happened. You imagine Italy and Shelley, went all over Italy following Shelley. And then you discover he also, of course, went to Ireland, to Scotland, He wanted to get to Greece. So all those things when he was with Byron, you follow in the footsteps. Similarly with Coleridge, who also, for example, you discover he was in Malta for 2 years during the Napoleonic War. Some of the last 3 letters written by the naval officers to Nelson are in Samuel Taylor Coleridge's hand, because he was the second chief administrator in wartime Malta. So quite surprising things come from following. So it's not just the archives. The archives are very important. I'll tell you one, we're not going to go too long, I'll give you one thing. Coleridge went up, of course, Lake District, Lake Poet. He worked, he had this wonderful study in Keswick. He had this rather unhappy marriage up there. The house I went to was then a girls' school by the time I got there. So I had to apply very delicately. I wrote a formal letter to matron. I was allowed in during the hockey period in the afternoon when there were no girls there. And I asked to go up to what the great room was Coleridge's study. It was actually the sixth form bedroom that looked very sweet, the dormitory, about 6. And I knew that Coleridge went out on the roofs. That's where he sat writing in his notebook. So I said to matron, would you mind if I climbed out of the window onto the roof? And matron, you got to see it. She thought, biographers, strange fellows. Anyway, I clambered out. Beautiful layers. I saw exactly the views that he'd written. The Ode to Dejection includes a wonderful description of nightscapes and so on. And I was on those same roof. Then, and this is the point of the story, I looked down at my feet. It was a low parapet. I saw several bottles of Vladivar vodka and a whole set of Black Russian cigarettes wrapped in plastic bag. I thought, oh, sixth formers, yes. And I climbed back in, and matron said to me, looked me in the eye and said, so, Mr. Holmes, did you find out anything interesting? Now, you know, biographers are artists upon oath. So I was none prepared to lie. But as she asked me that question, in the door, one of the sixth formers appeared. This beautiful, blonde, angelic figure in her little hockey outfit. And she was behind matron, and she looked over matron's shoulder at me and she said, so I said, yes, matron, I found clear signs of inspiration. And that was the best I could do. So, and just end that, yeah, for the ballooning, I went on a lot of hot air ballooning. I'm not naturally courageous, but I have to tell you, I've now ballooned in France. The most terrifying ballooning I had was in Australia, and also anybody who knows in New Mexico, in the great Albuquerque Balloon Festival, where we collided. My balloon collided with another balloon.
Wow.
But as it bounced and turned off, I saw the name of the balloon, and the balloon, remember this is the beach house. This balloon was called Jesus Saves. So I was like, so, enough, okay.
So I'm going to try to engineer what may be a bit of an awkward transition here and have Andrew read a bit, which will provide a way for us to come back to your Victorian balloon ride. Let me ask you, Andrew, before you start, to talk a bit about this book,
Yes.
The Victorians, which, am I right to say, is 2002?
It's a long time ago, certainly, yes. Certainly.
But, you know, maybe you can pick up a bit from what Richard has said. You've written biographies yourself. It might be grandiose to describe this as being, you know, an attempt to sort of write a biography of an era. How would you describe the work that you did to kind of inhabit this age in a way that I assume, you know, your goal was, look, here's something that has been written about ad nauseum, particularly in Britain, and so you're sitting down to do a book. What do you hope to bring that's new to this sort of, you know, what, a 70-year period, really?
It's a very good question. Of course, it is some time since I wrote this book, so I shall probably be inventing the answer, but that's probably the best type of answer. Certainly, following on from what Richard has said, I do think it's very important to try and inhabit the world that you're writing about. At the moment, I'm engaged on writing a biography of the Queen herself, Queen Victoria, and one of the things which people often say about her is that when she was widowed at the age of 42, she just went into a little retreat and didn't do anything for 10 years, and the politicians were always complaining. Once I followed the Richard Holmes formula of actually walking in the footsteps of this woman, I realized how completely untrue that piece of mythology is. She was actually a very active political figure, and the reason they didn't like her so much was that she wasn't doing nothing. She was doing things that they disapproved of, mainly in Germany. And she spent the 10 years that she was a widow, every single year she spent several months in Germany. And in a way, the most exciting thing for me has been going around Germany and staying in the places where she stayed, reading the innumerable letters she wrote to all her German relations. And she was really the first great European federalist that the British produced. And it was Prince Albert's belief that Europe would be saved by what we now have, namely a federation of nations living at peace with one another in a kind of union. And of course, British politicians, as is very notorious, have never liked that idea. So that's one of the things that I discovered by walking around or taking excellent trains around Germany in the footsteps of the Queen. But when I wrote this book, I was really trying to do what you've just suggested, which was to take a snapshot of the whole age. Particularly, I think, in this country and in Britain, one is aware of the Victorians all the time. Their legacy, the way they saw things, the way they did things. In some senses, we are still living in their world, and in other senses, they seem so utterly different from us that we might be talking about people from outer space. And I think one of the things which the Victorians invented, which is the bit I was thinking I might read now, either invented or discovered, I'm never quite sure what the right word is. In German it would be entdecken anyway, but take the roof off, is childhood. Something which came upon me very much when I was studying the Victorians specifically for the purposes of writing this book, was that before the 19th century, in Europe, there hadn't really been childhood. There'd just been a period of your life when you happened to be a baby up to the age of 13 or 14. Because most people had to work. Most people had to do something with their, what we now call childhood. I don't think there was even a word for childhood until the Victorian age. And the more I thought about it, I hope you don't think I'm totally Marxist, but the more I realized there were, of course, economic reasons for this. I'm just going to read a bit and skip about, and then perhaps get back to Richard, because he's more interesting than I am. But,
well, you go ahead and read, and then we'll talk a little bit, and then Richard will return us to the balloon.
This was the great era of carriage folk. Carriage folk was a phrase that people used for the emergent new rich. At the beginning of the century, elliptic springs had made this soon-to-be obsolete mode of transport enjoy a magnificent flowering. The berlin, the barouche, the calèche, the coupe, the clarence, the landau, all crowded the streets of London in that supposedly prosaic railway age. In 1814, there were 23,000 wheeled carriages in the capital. By 1834, 49,000. By 1864, 102,000, with a further 170 two-wheelers. This represents a huge social class, as well as great congestion in the streets. And it was this immensely privileged class, probably more comfortable than any human class who has ever existed on this planet, whose offspring were the first with the leisure and the time to have a childhood. Anybody who could do so in the 1860s was settling down to domestic life. Karl Marx's family abandoned their cramped apartment in Soho and moved to a variety of new-built family homes in Kentish Town on the edges of Hampstead Heath, where on Sundays the great economic philosopher would walk with his few surviving children and tell them stories. At the same point in time, Philip Webb was designing the Red House, Abbey Wood, for William Morris, that young idealist aesthete destined to become a revolutionary socialist, but not before he'd founded his firm, Morris & Co., on the back of the domestic bourgeoisie, hungry for new wallpapers, carpets, curtains, cushion covers. How wise Disraeli was. It is a privilege, he wrote in 1862, to live in this age of brilliant and rapid events. What an error to consider it a utilitarian age. It is one of infinite romance. Thrones tumble down, and crowns are offered like a fairy tale, and the most powerful people in the world, male and female, a few years past, were adventurers, exiles, demi-reps. Disraeli, as so often, appears to be dabbling in paradox or wit, but he actually had described what was the case. Capitalism was not just a relentless machine, crushing the wage slaves at the bottom. It also created a fantasy world of rapid social change. Leisure, fairy tale. It isn't accidental that the decade of the consolidation of the rentier class, the decade of the carriage folk, of the expansion of the suburbs, the growth of savings banks, the era of nouveau riche businessmen and stockbrokers, should also have been the golden age of children's literature. In the Victorian day nursery, a picture of the world would emerge simply from reading books on offer to that child of that age, which was every bit as revealing as that of Hansard or the Times. Think of the 1860s and the books it produced, or thereabouts. Thackeray's Rose and the Ring, 1855. Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market. Kingsley's The Water Babies, 1863. And then the era of the expanding schools for this class, which saw the publication of Tom Brown's School Days, Eric or Little by Little, and on the other side of the Atlantic, the prolific Louisa May Alcott began writing for children, Little Women, 1865, same time as Alice in Wonderland. The poor and the children of the poor continued throughout this decade to lead their scarcely endurable existences. On the 13th of April, 1861, the Statistical Society of London visited a single room occupied by 5 families. A separate family ate, drank, and slept in each of the 4 corners of the room, a 5th occupying the center. But how can you exist, asked the visitor of a poor woman whom he found in the room, the other inmates being absent upon their several avocations. How could you possibly exist? Oh, indeed, Your Honor, she replied. We did very well until the gentleman in the middle took a lodger.
Very good, very good. Well done. Very good.
So I want to put a question to both of you, because listening to Andrew talk about the sort of Victorian discovery of childhood, moderating one of these events, one is at risk of kind of imposing a continuity on multiple writers on stage. But I feel that both of you embody a kind of work of history that is about charting how the way we see the world changed in the past. You know, how we define we is a kind of broad question, but this idea that, you know, to write the history of a person or the history of an era, the biography of a person or the history of an era, is in part to chart how that person or that era began to sort of frame its own sense of itself and sense of the world very differently. You know, I'm thinking, Richard, of you know, what you've written about in The Age of Wonder, broadly speaking, about sort of bringing in this sensibility of what I believe Coleridge called the second scientific revolution, and how that informed you know, artists, poets, and things like that. And then Andrew, or I'm sorry, again, Richard, the very idea that the technology of the balloon, which for the first time lifted man up above the earth, was not simply a technological advance that lets you float up in the skies as long as you wanted, but really radically started to change the sensibility of how people in these eras saw, well, what's the meaning of what we're doing here and what's possible? Let me ask Andrew first to sort of talk about, you know, is this something you see as a goal when you set out to write a book like this, or?
I think so, yes, very much so. And just picking up on what you're both talking about, and this wonderful book, The Age of Wonder, which I do strongly recommend to you. One of my little footsteps, again following in the Holmes tradition, I was writing a book a couple of years ago about Josiah Wedgwood. It was a novel. And I followed in his footsteps, and, or one footstep, and the other was a wooden leg, so that it was foot. And something which was borne in upon me tremendously was very much what Richard writes about in The Age of Wonder. how extraordinarily the human race, during those decades towards the end of the 18th century, changed their perception of what it meant really to be alive on this planet because of science. And one of the places I went to, following the old peg leg around England, was Birmingham, Brummagem as they pronounced it. And there's this beautiful house designed by James Wyatt, where Matthew Boulton, one of the first great industrialists of the world, lived. And he had this dinner, which was very famous throughout England, called the Lunar Society, or the Lunar Men. But it was called that because without street lights and without very good gig lamps or headlamps on your coach, it wasn't particularly safe to go out dining, except when there was a full moon. So they used to meet once a month when there was a full moon, and they could travel quite big distances, because they, of course, dined early in those days, before the light faded. Sitting around that table, which is there exactly as it was in Birmingham, because it was a house that became a police college, and they didn't spend any money on it, so it's marvelous. It's absolutely as it was when these amazing men sat round this table. Matthew Boulton, the great industrialist, obviously, with his partner, James Watt, who had really discovered the power of steam. Why had he discovered the power of steam? Because another person sitting around the table was Wedgwood's great friend Priestley, who was in a way, as far as the British Isles was concerned anyway, Lavoisier in France was making more or less identical discoveries. He was inventing chemistry, basically, and he was discovering that water was made up of H2O. Once you'd seen these people sitting around the table together, you saw the way all the technology came together, because Priestley could actually tell you the composition of this stuff. Watt and Boulton immediately could see you could make a steam engine. The minute you understood what water actually was, you could make a steam engine. And Wedgwood, who by then became a very rich man and saw the practicality of everything as well as the philosophical implications of it, could say, well, I like the idea of that. I'll buy one of those steam engines if you make a steam engine. So he was the first person to buy a steam engine. It's an extraordinary fact that the ancient Egyptians in the age of Philo invented the steam engine. They had one, and they displayed it, but they couldn't see what possible use it would be. They thought it was, I don't know if you have ever done this, but we used to light candles when we were little children, and then you could have, you could make angels or fairies dance around in a circle through the heat of the candle. The Egyptians, in the time of Philo, thought that a steam engine was a toy of that nature. They couldn't see that it could propel anything or be of the slightest use. Whereas this generation, their imaginations, their minds, their hearts, their desire and need to make lots of money were all focused around chemistry, which led out of this to the Industrial Revolution, the creation of the class I've just described, and more or less everything about the modern world. And you just felt it sitting around this table. If it hadn't been for this very biographical insight, which he leads the way in, really, telling us how to do it, as you follow in their footsteps, think their thoughts, make their discoveries, you see the whole world changing just in this one table, really.
Richard, so let me ask you about this in terms of, when you go, obviously we're accustomed today because we're so attuned to kind of changes in technology and how these things change our lives. Do you feel, or did you feel when you set out to write Age of Wonder that this was a neglected aspect of the past? That in the present, we're very attuned to this idea, to how, right, there's a great book by Shivelbush about how railway travel changed European sense of time and space. But in earlier eras, one got the sense before your book was written that the way that technology or science shifted sensibility, even of a literary sort or a humanities sort, had not previously really been written about.
Yes, I think that's true. One of the great challenges, I think, to biographical writing is to make your reader feel what was not known at the time, to take you back in terms of sensibilities. So as you say, the composition of water up to the point was thought to be one of the 4 elements and so on. And all the time one is working with this, trying to push away the modern world and to take the reader back. It's also a great deal of help, I've found, always beginning in ignorance. I once gave a lecture at Oxford called The Necessary Ignorance of the Biographer. They looked at me rather frowningly, actually, about that. But it is true, because by finding your way, this is part of footstepping, by finding your way through archives, what's happening, learning the science, it's in the learning process that that goes into the book and makes it fresh. So the idea of changing sensibilities is often focused through particular lives. And let me give, because the Victorian book, I want to push towards this. It's a wonderful book, this book, and that passage you read, starting with just the statistics of the carriages, and then going right out to Disraeli and an overview. And that's the thing one's trying to do all the time. And you mentioned, for instance, Water Babies by Charles Kingsley, which is also a book about early Darwin's theory. In Memoriam, the great Tennyson poem, which has begun just at the end of this period, 1830, it's meant to be an elegy for his great friend Arthur Hallam, in memoriam of A.H. But what it turns gradually into is an elegy for a lost sensibility, a religious sensibility, which has been destroyed by, first of all, not Darwin, because Darwin hasn't published, by Lyell, the great geologist, who has proved that the biblical account of the Earth can't possibly be true.
The age of the Earth in this case,
yes, that's right.
And it wasn't just, of course, the age. What Tennyson in that poem found so appalling, and of course it is appalling if you think of the Bible telling us that God minds if a single sparrow falls to the ground, because what the fossil evidence showed to Lyell and the early geologists was that there were whole species which, as Tennyson said, were cast as rubbish to the void. Whole species were brought into being by the great process of creative nature and then discarded, and they didn't exist. And what about us? Never mind poor Arthur Hallam dying and coming back to be buried in, overlooking the Bristol Channel. We're all grieving for him as Tennyson grieves for his friend. But what about us, the human race? Because hiding behind that poem is the thought that maybe, with our top hats and our frock coats and our expensive carriages, we too are going to become obsolete. We too are going to fade away into total extinction.
Well, I think this is the point that's most interesting, and in a way Andrew has shown me, I think, a better way to put it, which is that we're all aware of how scientific discoveries change our view of science. But what seems underreported, particularly when we get further back in the past, is how scientific discoveries change our view of other things that are not science. So it's, you know, we can talk about evolution or Lyell or Darwin and how those controversies were their own sort of scientific rows, but the way that a whole other sphere of life was impacted or subtly shifted by that.
I'll give you one example, which actually will bring in my Victorian balloon, which I'm very excited to do.
Very good.
And which starts in a scientific way. Okay, this is a second balloon flight made in 1862, and it was sponsored by the Royal Society, and it was made by two men, Henry Coxwell and James Glacier, who was the secretary of the newly founded Meteorological Society. And this is very Victorian. The decision was no one knew what happened above about 15,000 feet. No one knew if it got hotter or colder. No one knew if you went into clouds above that level if you'd be electrocuted by static electricity. No one knew if you could go on living up there. So the Royal Society commissioned this balloon to go up as high as you could go. Very Victorian idea, reflecting all kinds of world expeditions out to the Arctic and so on, out to Africa. But this is a vertical expedition. It took off from Wolverhampton in a September day in 1862. They went through 15,000, 20,000 feet. Just to give you a preparation, Everest, which hadn't been climbed, is 29,000 feet, and we all know climbers go into what they call the dead zone just before that, the death zone, all right. Now these guys, they had a Victorian little mobile laboratory with barometers, chronometers, temperature measures, and Glacier, who was a Victorian scientist, absolute prototype. He had wonderful, those long mutton chop whiskers. He had a very large family who were furious that he was going up in a balloon, incidentally, particularly Mrs. Glacier. And while he went up in the balloon, he just leant, he had a table there, and he took all the readings from his barometers, measurement, air pressure, and he never seemed to look up. I've seen the journal, and I worked out he was taking 12 separate readings a minute from his instruments. So as they went up, he was just noting, looking up, up. They went through 20,000 feet. They got to 25,000 feet. And then Glacier, making his notes, realized he couldn't read the instruments. His eyesight was going, because of course oxygen was running out. 26,000 feet. He could see they were going up at 1,000 feet a minute, but he could no longer read clearly. He reached forward for his bottle of brandy. Being a good Victorian, he had that there. He realized that his arm, all the muscle strength had gone in his arm. And then he just slumped back on the basket. There's a famous Victorian lithograph of this. And he said his eyesight was going, he couldn't move, and he realized he was dying. It was as simple as that. And he was going to die. 26, 27, 28,000 feet. Henry Coxwell, who was the pilot, was having the same sensations, but was a bit more practiced, and he realized the one thing he had to do was pull the release rope to release the hydrogen to bring the balloon down. Now, in ballooning, things always go wrong. He looked up, the release valve rope had been tangled in the hoop above his head. He couldn't reach it. So he climbed out of the basket into the hoop above the basket. Mind you, his muscular strength was going. It was very difficult to grip. There's a famous picture of him canting backwards, just holding on with one leg. When he got the rope, he couldn't hold it. He couldn't pull it. He knocked it down so it dropped into the basket. He put his arms across the hoop, lowered himself into it, eyesight now going, muscular power now going. What did he do? In his previous life, he'd been a dentist. That was his connection with gases, the same gases that Davy had explored. So he gripped the rope between his teeth and pulled, and the gas released. And they were probably at 33,000 feet. Then he went over to Mr. Glacier, who was slumped, probably dead in the back of the basket. And there's this most wonderful, only Victorian account. He leans over him, his great friend. He shakes him, and he says, Mr. Glacier, do try and take some readings. That's Victorian science. And Glacier wakes up, and damn me, I look at the thing. After 13 minutes, back he's noting it down. And he's precisely measured the point he stopped reading and the point he started again. He had the chronometer time on it, so he worked out the lapsed time, so they could work out that they'd actually gone, it's amazing, 7 miles, which is way beyond the death zone. And they survived. And the punch at the end, incidentally, when he wrote a brilliant paper about this, he established that the oxygen level at 7 miles, it's gone, so that you lose the biosphere, the troposphere, where animals, men, women, birds can exist. There is a new layer. It's the first definition of the stratosphere, and instantly the temperature stabilizes at that point. The French went on with this. So that what he established, and this is sort of comes back to you saying how the sensibility changed. For the first time, it was realized that our entire planet existed in this tiny skin, 7 miles. How far could you walk out of Jaipur? For 7 miles, right? That's the entire thing, that's what we depend on. And for the first time, this was realized that we were in this, what we now think of as our fragile, delicate planet. And those two, Victorian science, established that, published the papers about it. The final bit of Victoriana is this. They came down after this death experience. They landed in the countryside near a place called Ludlow, but in fact, in open countryside, nobody there. So what did they do? They collapsed the balloon, and arm in arm, Mr. Coxwell and Mr. Glacier walked 7 miles, the same distance they'd flown up, to the nearest pub where they bought each other a pint of beer. So that's, for me, Victorian science.
We've had quite a tour here, up and down in carriages and balloons. I think we have about 10 minutes left for some questions from the audience. I'm not quite sure how to unify all these different themes. Has anyone got one? Yeah, right there. Take the microphone there.
That was one of the most moving accounts I've ever heard. I would love it if you could describe the footsteps in that balloon story of 1862. How did you put all that together?
Okay.
No,
I'm going to try and do that. Right. Well, I'd studied balloons. There are various balloon museums, notably in Le Bourget in France. So particularly the French actually did on this. So I knew that the kind of where they were up to in 1862, the kind of instruments they had. Their instruments were mostly Italian, incidentally, who made the best and most accurate barometers and so on. Then they have their own records, Glaciers' own journals, which exist, Royal Aeronautical Society. And then there was, for example, the most wonderful leader in the Times. I don't know if we can pluck this out of the air. It's, of course, in this one. But the Times wrote one of their sort of thundered lead poetry. This is the Times, 1 week after that flight. Poetry has described some famous descents into the subterranean world, but we have just had an ascent such as the world has never heard of or dreamed of. 2 men have been nearer by some miles to the moon and the stars and any of the race of man before them. And then there's about the science and so on. So that I found that in the papers, never before dug out. Literally, you find that in the archives. I think that was in the London Library. So you begin to build up a picture, and then how people in letters react to that. And then my own ballooning experiences, and particularly that the scene in the basket, and that thing where the rope goes wrong and so on. I've been in situations like that. So that it all builds it into the picture. So it's quite complicated. It's a mixture of experience, a bit of scientific background, a bit of technical journals, and a bit of newspaper writing. So that's the kind of way you do it, roughly.
All right. Who's next? Right there in.
Microphone.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Yeah, she's asking about Andrew. She's asking Andrew about Queen Victoria.
Yeah.
You're working on Queen Victoria, are you?
Yes.
I was very interested in knowing, her role as a domestic queen and her public role. I think there was a dichotomy there, that she saw herself as a wife and wanted to share power with her husband, which was sort of critiqued by politicians so could you talk a little bit about that?
Did everybody hear
anyone hasn't heard, the question is about how Victoria...
The question really is the dual role that Queen Victoria saw herself as having. On the one hand, a wife and mother, and on the other hand, a great monarch. Like a great many other powerful women, Mrs. Thatcher flits in and out of one's consciousness at this point. She didn't really like the idea of any other woman in the world having any power or influence whatsoever. And she was very hostile to any manifestation of feminism, which she regarded as positively wicked, actually. She hated, for example, the idea of women doctors, and thought it was absolutely disgusting that women should be allowed into a consulting room or, above all, a dissecting room. She had a very ambivalent attitude towards her role as the monarch once she'd married Prince Albert. On the one hand, she believed herself to be born to rule, which was technically speaking true. And she disliked the fact that he was so intelligent politically and that he understood the setup of these all-male political parties and political groupings in England much better than she did. On the other hand, she was temperamentally, like many melancholy people, like Dr. Johnson, a lazy person, and she loved him doing all the work, so that she had to have the luxury both of not doing the work and complaining about the way he did it. She had tremendous rows with her husband, because on the one hand she would write him letters saying, I really think as a woman I'm better fitted just to be a private person and have the children and live my own domestic life while you do the politics. On the other hand, if he made any political decision with which she disagreed, which was about once a week, there was a row. So that the idea we have of it being a beautiful and harmonious marriage based on a shared interest is only half the truth. Perhaps there's never anything more than a half truth. The funny thing which happened is that when he died, only aged 42, and Prince Albert was a genius by any standards. He was the most extraordinary person. He knew a huge range of languages. He was a very good musical composer. He was a good amateur scientist. He had an immense knowledge of technology. There was the story of him going to Leeds to see a new wool weaving machine. And you know the way public figures, presidents and royal people, are shown into a room. They see a boring machine and they nod and say, how interesting, and where do you live, and what do your children do, and then they go out again. Prince Albert asked the next day to go back, and the inventor of the machine was still standing there. And Prince Albert said, I've been thinking about that machine all night. You see, I can see the way that cog goes round there and that cog goes round there and the wheels come in. But what happens when the shuttle is moving across? Because there should be a cog there and it's missing. And the man said, oh, Your Royal Highness, as a matter of fact, I had got that missing. I've just lost it in my pocket now. Prince Albert had noticed that there was this tiny bit of the machine that was missing. So he was that kind of a man. He had also mastered, before he even arrived in England, the political potential of Britain, not only to be an emergent parliamentary state which would one day turn into a democracy, but also be the beacon for liberal Europe. All liberals in Europe looked, rather astonishingly, when one thinks how very illiberal Victorian England was in many ways, towards England as the ideal. And when he died, only 42 years old, the Queen was left, obviously, bereft. At the same time, she felt, as I was hinting earlier, that she wanted to carry on that beacon of European liberalism, which she doggedly did throughout her grief, and obviously all the things they stood for. German federalism, the German anthem, Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, which we think of as such a militaristic and frightening song in many ways, was a liberal anthem. The idea was that all these little states, rather similar to the Indian states all coming together, would come together in a liberal federalism. That was what über alles meant. It didn't mean bossing the rest of Europe around. But of course, Prussia was the state in Germany which Queen Victoria most feared. She thought to neuter its power by marrying her daughter, and it didn't work, and Bismarck and militarism arrived. But that's a rather long answer, but she was undoubtedly politically engaged.
I think we have time for one last question. I'm going to ask this man here in the front row who's gestating rather enthusiastically. My apologies to everyone else who is less enthusiastic. Gesticulating, yes, I'm sorry. It's still very early and some of us have not had very much coffee, I'm sorry. Go ahead, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? It was a single hand from a single arm. There were all the fingers together. Mr. Wilson, on the subject of the federal Europe and people getting Bolshevik, is it correct? I read somewhere that very soon after a high German person, was it Bismarck, declared himself, or somebody declared themselves emperor, soon after that, Victoria was persuaded to declare herself Empress of India. Is
Yes.
there a connection?
Well, I mean, I feel Richard Holmes should be talking rather than me all the time, but yes, Queen Victoria was liked, as most royal people do, titles and flummery. Her daughter, as I mentioned, Vicky, she was originally the Crown Princess of Prussia, then became Queen of Prussia, and then by the time her husband was going to become the leader of a united Germany after 1870, he would have been the Emperor. And she thought that was a little bit dodgy, particularly as she could see coming along the inside lane grandchildren. One of them was destined to be the Empress of Russia. And she thought, my daughter's an empress, my granddaughter, why the hell shouldn't I be an empress? Where can I be the empress of? And Disraeli, with his great zest for fantasy, came up with this beautiful idea, Madam, you should become the Empress of India, which makes her, I think, sound rather like a railway engine, but it was a title of which she was very proud, and as you know, she was she introduced lots of Indians into her life and into her household, so that India had a tremendous imaginative effect upon her, and she learnt Hindustani, and indeed a little Urdu.
I think that's as good a place to...
She wasn't allowed to come here, but Bertie, her son, came here. She was obsessed by all the number of regiments he was nabbing. Prince of Wales Regiment, but she wanted, why can't they be the Royal Queen's Regiment?
I am unfortunately compelled to bring things to an end here. Everyone, please, a big hand for Andrew Wilson and Richard Holmes. Fantastic, guys. Thank you. They will both be signing books outside, so if you have further questions about Queen Victoria or balloons, you can address them in person. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Extraordinary session. Please join the speakers at the signing tent and give them some space to leave. Thank you all.